In 2005, a quiet American town was shaken by a chilling event. A young woman disappeared without a trace from her home, leaving behind her belongings, phone, and car. The subsequent investigation of this case felt like a typical detective series, with one key difference. Everything was happening in real life. The small town was engulfed in an atmosphere of fear and distrust, as anyone in the community could have been involved in the girl's disappearance. It wasn't until 12 years later that the world learned the terrifying truth. Tara Grinstead was born in 1974 in the city of Hawkinsville, USA. During her school years, she actively participated in beauty contests, frequently taking top prizes. She set a goal for herself to receive a quality education, so she saved the money she earned from contests to pay for her studies. After graduating from college, Tara earned a master's degree in educational sciences and got the job she had always dreamed of: a history teacher at a middle school in the small town of Ocilla, Georgia. This small town was the epitome of rural America, with a population of less than 4,000 people, most of whom knew each other well. Life there flowed quietly and steadily, and no one could imagine that something so serious could happen in their town. Tara worked at the local school for several years, during which she built wonderful relationships with both her colleagues and students. She was a kind and sociable person, always ready to offer support and lend a hand. In October 2005, she was helping her students prepare for a local beauty contest. Given that their teacher had frequently won prizes at such events, the girls were thrilled by her support. On Saturday, October 22nd, Tara helped her students with the final preparations for the contest. After that, she went to a picnic with her school friends and returned home around 11 o'clock in the evening, parking her car under the awning. After that, Tara stopped answering her phone. Her mother, who lived in another city, was the most worried. Her daughter always answered the phone or called back, but this time there was no reply. On Monday, October 24th, her concern reached its peak. Tara didn't show up for work, which was extremely unusual for her. She took her job very seriously and would have definitely informed her supervisor if she needed time off. Worried friends of Tara called Police Chief Billy Hancock and asked him to check if everything was all right. At 10 a.m. that same day, he went to her house. The officer assumed that Tara's phone had simply died, or that she had fallen ill or overslept. Upon arriving at her house, he found her car in its usual spot, and the doors were unlocked, which was not surprising in such a small town. However, he noticed something odd. A $100 bill was lying on the dashboard. It seemed strange that such a responsible person like Tara would leave money in plain sight. Billy knocked on the door, but no one answered. He decided to check the house. At first glance, everything seemed normal. No signs of a struggle or a break-in. However, in the bedroom, there was an unusual mess that was not characteristic of Tara. Her belongings were scattered on the floor, including the clothes she had last been seen wearing. Her mobile phone was lying on the bedside table, still charging. Everything appeared as if Tara had stepped out for a moment, but she was nowhere to be found. Outside the house, the police discovered the first clue that suggested something criminal had happened: a latex glove, likely used by someone to avoid leaving fingerprints. The detectives did not consider the possibility that the glove could have belonged to Tara, as such gloves were rarely used for everyday tasks. With this clue in hand, the case was handed over to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. The primary theory was that Tara had been abducted. Evidence was scarce. In addition to the glove, the detectives found only two suspicious details: Tara's broken necklace on the bedroom floor and her alarm clock, which was not in its usual place. However, these clues did little to help detectives solve the mystery of her disappearance. For the small town, that Monday turned into a nightmare. Tara's house was cordoned off, and the school held an emergency meeting. Colleagues and students did everything they could to help with the search by forming a group of volunteers. They printed dozens of flyers with Tara's photo and information about her disappearance. Within hours, these flyers were spread throughout the town. Volunteers continued searching until late at night. Agents from the Bureau of Investigation interviewed Tara's neighbors and combed through the area where she lived. Tracking dogs were brought in, hoping to pick up the scent of the missing woman. The investigators held on to the hope that Tara had simply gone for a walk and that the dogs would easily find her. Meanwhile, the latex glove was sent to experts for a thorough analysis. They managed to extract a DNA sample from it, but no matches were found in the FBI database. All they knew was that the sample belonged to a man. Unfortunately, none of this yielded results. Tara had seemingly vanished without a trace from her own home. The detectives then decided to dig deeper into her personal life. In cases of missing women, it's often someone from their close circle who is responsible. After thoroughly investigating the men Tara had been involved with, the detectives were unable to single out any suspects. The person she had dated the longest was Marcus Harper, a former police officer and military veteran. They had broken up about a year before her disappearance, at Tara's initiative. The reason for the breakup was that Tara wanted to start a family, while Marcus was not ready for that. Despite the breakup, they remained on friendly terms, sometimes calling and texting each other. Later, the detectives uncovered an interesting detail. Marcus had visited Ocilla 3 weeks before Tara's disappearance, but had not informed her of his visit. When Tara found out from mutual friends that Marcus had been in town, she was very upset. She repeatedly called him, trying to understand why he hadn't told her. Her emotional state soon escalated into a full-blown meltdown, worrying her family. They even began to fear that she might do something reckless. However, she eventually calmed down, and the police stopped considering Marcus a suspect. Soon, the investigation took an unexpected turn. The police learned that Tara had been threatened by one of her former students. On March 13, 2005, 7 months before her disappearance, this student showed up at her house and acted extremely aggressively. When Tara refused to let him in, he began banging on the door, forcing neighbors to call the police. It was revealed that the young man had been in love with his teacher since high school. According to Tara's acquaintances, he was emotionally unstable and exhibited strange, even frightening behavior. For a while, Tara tried to help him with his issues, but his mental state only worsened. After the incident where he tried to break into her home, she filed a police report, as she feared for her safety. After Tara's disappearance, the police tracked down this young man. He was working in a nearby town, about 150 kilometers from Ocilla. The man provided detectives with an alibi for the night his former teacher went missing, and there was no evidence to link him to her disappearance. Inside Tara's home, police also found a business card belonging to a police officer with whom she had been romantically involved for a while. However, by the time Tara disappeared, this man had already moved to another city. He also provided an alibi for the night Tara went missing. At this point, the list of potential suspects had nearly dried up. With no solid leads, the police decided to organize a formal search for Tara several weeks after her disappearance. This delay seemed strange, as it had been clear from the start that Tara hadn't left her home voluntarily. Hundreds of volunteers combed the area around Ocilla, searching the forests, ditches, and rivers, but no trace of Tara was found. During the search, a report came in about a house and car burning down near Tara's home. The local residents were almost unanimous in their belief that this incident was somehow related to the woman's disappearance. Perhaps the perpetrator was trying to cover their tracks. However, it was also possible that the community, already shocked and scared, saw suspicion in every event. Regardless, the search yielded no results, and the police faced a grim reality. They had no more leads to follow. For the next few years, the investigation barely progressed. Then, in 2009, an event occurred that once again brought attention to Tara Grinstead's disappearance. In 2009, an event occurred that once again brought attention to Tara Grinstead's disappearance. A user created a YouTube channel and uploaded a deeply unsettling video. In the video, a man sat with his face obscured and his voice altered. He claimed to be responsible for the disappearance of 16 girls, listing their names. Among them was Tara Grinstead. The man added that he had hidden the bodies well and would give clues about their burial sites in future videos. The police quickly investigated the video and discovered that all 16 names belonged to real missing women. The FBI was able to track down the person behind the video fairly quickly. The author turned out to be 27-year-old Andrew Hale. Upon his arrest, he admitted that the video was just a sick joke. The police found no connection between Andrew and any of the missing women, but he was still unable to avoid punishment. For providing false testimony and falsifying evidence, he was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor and 13 years of probation. The fleeting hopes of solving this cold case were extinguished, and once again, the police were left without a single lead. In December 2010, Tara Grinstead was officially declared deceased, as there was simply no more evidence or clues for the police to work with. The years passed, and while the people of Ocilla still remembered Tara's mysterious disappearance, it was spoken about less and less. Conversations about her were confined to private settings, and the topic was rarely raised in everyday life. The town had changed forever. An air of fear and distrust had settled over the residents for years to come. However, in 2016, something happened that once again got people talking about Tara openly. Journalist Payne Lindsay from Atlanta created a podcast dedicated to mysterious cases, and for his first episode he chose the case of Tara Grinstead. Together with private investigator Morris Godwin, they began investigating the case from scratch, as they had no access to police documents. Their only source of information was the town's residents. At first, they were only able to speak with Tara's friends and relatives. Most other people avoided discussing her disappearance, but soon Lindsay's enthusiasm reignited interest in the case, and before long, Ocilla's residents began talking about it again. Lindsay and Godwin explored every possible lead, considering 3 potential suspects: Tara's former boyfriends and the student who had tried to break into her home. Along the way, they spoke with anyone who might have had even the smallest piece of useful information. They were so engrossed in the case that on multiple occasions, it seemed like they were just one step away from solving it. One day, Lindsay received a call from an anonymous person who suggested that the police should search for remains on Tara's property. The police followed this tip, and at one point, they did indeed find bones. However, experts quickly determined that the bones belonged to an animal. Despite the renewed interest and excitement surrounding the case, no significant breakthroughs occurred. Although Lindsay and Godwin didn't manage to solve the case directly through their podcast, it was this amateur investigation that became the catalyst for the long-awaited resolution. The resolution came unexpectedly. In early 2017, a woman named Brooke Sheridan came forward to the police with a story that shocked the detectives, who had long since lost hope that the truth would ever come out. Brooke told the investigators that her ex-boyfriend, Bo Dukes, had once confessed to her that he had helped his friend dispose of Tara Grinstead's body. After learning this, Brooke had begged Bo multiple times to turn himself in, but he had remained silent. Hearing Brooke's story, the police decided not to rush into anything. Who knew? Perhaps she was just seeking attention or fame, especially now that the successful podcast had brought Tara's case back into the public eye. The detectives wanted to be certain before taking any action, so they asked Brooke to wear a wire and confront Bo Dukes to get a confession from him. It worked. Bo Dukes admitted his involvement, and the police finally had enough evidence to arrest him. Surprisingly, Bo immediately cooperated with the investigation and revealed everything. He later told detectives that he had grown tired of living with the burden of the secret. According to Bo's confession, late one night, his friend and former classmate Ryan Duke called him and asked for help. Ryan wanted to borrow Bo's truck and needed help with something, after which he added, "I broke into Tara Grinstead's house to steal some money, but something went wrong, and I killed her." As Ryan's story goes, after a night of partying with friends, he had been driving around when he decided to break into Tara's house to steal money. At the time, he was under the influence of drugs. Using a credit card to open the door, he entered the house and began searching for money. Tara caught him in the act, and a struggle ensued, which ended with Ryan killing her. When Bo Dukes arrived at Tara's house with the truck, the two of them loaded her body into it and drove into the woods, where they spent the next several days disposing of the remains. This horrifying story stunned the residents of Ocilla. Neither Ryan Duke nor Bo Dukes had ever been considered suspects because they had no obvious motive, and there had been no clues connecting them to Tara's disappearance. Despite his full confession, Bo Dukes refused to testify against himself in court. During the trial, he stood in front of Tara's relatives, wept, and begged for their forgiveness. Bo had served in the military for a long time and was a veteran with numerous honors, but that didn't change the outcome. The court sentenced him to 25 years in prison for his role in helping to conceal the crime. As for Ryan Duke, his trial has dragged on for years, even 4 years after his arrest. This is largely due to the work of his defense attorneys, who have used various legal loopholes to delay the inevitable. There is no doubt that Ryan will end up in prison, but when exactly the court will deliver its final verdict remains unclear. Now that the truth about this high-profile case has finally come to light, Tara's friends and family can at last feel some relief from the weight of uncertainty. Her mother confessed that all these years she had secretly held on to the hope that a miracle might happen, that her daughter would somehow return alive. But the reality was cruel, with no room for miracles. At least now, the whole world knows what really happened in that small town back in 2005. Meet Abby Choi, a high society girl from Hong Kong who had it all, and I mean all. The world couldn't stop talking about her lavish lifestyle, her massive social media following, and, of course, her fortune, which was estimated at a jaw-dropping $100 million. Her stunning face graced the pages of high-end fashion magazines like Walk and Liao Ficelle. Basically, she was living the dream. But then, on February 21st, 2023, Abby just vanished. Poof, gone. Left everyone scratching their heads, wondering how someone so visible could simply disappear. The police kicked off a massive search, even pulling in the Flying Tigers squad. Yes, that's a real thing. It took them just 3 days to uncover the horrifying truth. Welcome to my channel, where we dive into real crimes and strange phenomena. If that's your jam, hit that button down below and let's get into it. Hong Kong, a bustling city full of some of the richest people on Earth. And Abby Choi? She was living right at the top. Hong Kong's skyline boasts 7,500 skyscrapers soaring over 100 meters tall, creating a breathtaking cityscape. It's a playground for the wealthy elite, who indulge in more Rolls-Royces per capita than anywhere else in the world. These same people frequent world-class restaurants, enjoy haute cuisine, luxury shopping, and exclusive private clubs. But while the city's rich bask in their opulence, the gap between the wealthy and the struggling is growing wider by the day. Many in Hong Kong are just scraping by, barely making ends meet. In recent years, this disparity has sparked social unrest. protests against the government, and calls for more democracy and equality. And yet, despite all this tension, Hong Kong remains a vibrant, captivating city, a unique blend of cultures with a booming economy. It was in this world, among Hong Kong's elite, that Abby Choi was raised. A world-renowned model and an icon of Hong Kong aristocracy, Abby was born on July 11, 1994, as the youngest of 4 daughters in a wealthy family that owned multiple construction companies across Hong Kong and China. Her mother reportedly owned numerous properties and held multi-million-dollar assets, ensuring Abby and her family lived in luxury. But despite being born into immense wealth, Abby made a conscious choice early on. She wasn't going to just live off her family's fortune. She set her sights on building a career in the spotlight, determined to make a name for herself in the media world. Her captivating journey began on Instagram. Back then, her first post featured a Lady Dior handbag worth a whopping $6,000. Gradually, she went from that to posting pictures of herself lounging in the presidential suites of the Ritz-Carlton. Her soft demeanor and stunning appearance quickly garnered her a massive following, leading to invites to exclusive parties with luxury designer brands. Dior, for instance. But those events were just the tip of the iceberg. She also indulged in luxurious vacations in Bali and attended fashion events in Paris, of course. Now, it's true that Abby was born into a wealthy and successful family, but I'm more than sure her parents didn't just get lucky. Success takes brains, education, and effort. She grew up surrounded by all that glamour, and in 2013, at the age of 18, she found love. She married a man named Alex Kwong, and they had 2 kids. But their marriage didn't last long, just 3 years before it ended in divorce. Despite that, Abby stayed loyal to Alex and his entire family. So loyal, in fact, that she bought them a lavish apartment in one of Hong Kong's wealthiest suburbs, a luxurious $8,000 residence with marble floors, walls, and a magnificent courtyard, a clear testament to her trust and care. What's even more striking is that Abby registered the property under Alex's father's name, saving nearly $1,000 in the process. And yet she doesn't even live there. Every member of the Kwong family, including Alex himself, his wife, and kids, now call it home. Formally, Alex was just a trustee, meaning Abby could always prove that she was the one who bought the place. Classic case of keep your enemies close, I guess. So, technically, Abby could have contested ownership of the property if she ever needed to. Not the most comfortable situation, considering she single-handedly bought the place but didn't benefit from it in any way. Sure, it secured her kids' future, but let's be real. Her ex-husband and his family were part of her past, a burden she had to carry. That couldn't have been easy. And over time, the situation only got worse. What might have seemed like a good idea in the beginning became more of a nightmare. How long was she expected to keep paying for them? A year? 3? 10? It's about time we talk about another Kwong family member, Anthony, Alex's older brother, who was 31 at the time. Just like the rest of Alex's family, Abby felt this weird sense of responsibility towards him. 2 years earlier, when her marriage to Alex was still solid, Anthony was struggling, jobless, barely scraping by. In an attempt to ease his situation, Abby hired him as her personal driver, and that arrangement blossomed into a friendship. They became close, and soon enough, Anthony started referring to Abby as his sister. His Instagram was filled with pictures of the 2 of them together, and he regularly posted from his account as if she was part of his family. Around that time, a couple of small but successful businesses were launched, including a pancake stall in the heart of the city, where Anthony took charge during his off hours from driving. Rumor had it, he managed to save up quite a bit by balancing both roles with flair. But back to Abby. Sometime after her divorce, she found love again with a man named Chris Tam. Seems like Abby had a knack for picking up pieces and moving forward, though one can't help but wonder how long she had to keep dragging along all that Kwong baggage. They exchanged vows at a lavish ceremony, the kind that screams money talks. In 2016, some long-lost wedding footage resurfaced, showing only the closest of family and friends. Kinda makes you wonder who they didn't invite, right? Anyway, Chris, a successful entrepreneur hailing from Hong Kong just like Abby, grew up in a family that had more than enough cash to go around. His dad? Oh, just the founder of a renowned restaurant chain that everybody loves to brag about. No big deal. Together, Chris and Abby had 2 kids, and although Abby already had 2 children from her previous relationship, the 4 siblings surprisingly got along well. So well, they often spent weekends together, frolicking through Disneyland and taking extravagant trips on private yachts like it was no biggie. But let's not kid ourselves. Behind all that Instagram perfect life, Abby's wild success had nothing to do with this whole family bliss thing. Thanks to her killer connections and a wallet the size of a small country, she transformed herself from just another fashion icon and media darling into an actual media mogul. Her charisma, impeccable figure, and killer sense of style got her splashed across the covers of big-name magazines like Harper's Bazaar, and she even graced Official and Work. Still, behind those glossy covers, by the time 2023 rolled around, tensions between Abby and the Kwan family were reaching a boiling point. The Kwans had been living in her house, the one she bought over 6 years ago. At first, she was fine with it. Sure, take the guest room, make yourselves at home. But as she got older, and probably a little wiser, she realized she was being taken advantage of. And honestly, she owed them nothing. When she got that apartment, she was young, impressionable, and yeah, maybe a bit naive. But now? Oh, she was done playing the fool. Rumor had it that Alex's father convinced Abby to buy that apartment. Manipulative? Maybe. But now, Abby wanted her place back, like yesterday. Unfortunately, this wasn't the only bad news for the illustrious Wong family. Alex's father, Cao, once a respected police sergeant in Hong Kong, was known for his impeccable service. You could say he was a model cop, right up until 2005, when things took a nosedive. He got accused of assaulting a woman, and instead of clearing his name or facing the charges like a stand-up guy, he just resigned. Case closed. The Hong Kong police conveniently swept it under the rug. No punishment, no reprimand. Classic. But Cao wasn't the only Wong with a skeleton or 10 in the closet. Alex? Oh, he had his own mess of shady dealings. At one point, the guy even went into hiding from the cops for a couple of years. In 2015, he decided to reinvent himself as an investor and set his sights on the gold market. Sounds legitimate, right? Except instead of risking his own cash, he charmed 4 wealthy businessmen into trusting him with their money. You see where this is going, right? $500,000 later, Alex didn't even try to invest. He just made off with the cash, pulling a full-on Houdini. And it wasn't just shady business. The family had serious financial issues too. Alex's brother Anthony was drowning in debt. Even after being bailed out more than once, he couldn't kick the habit of spending more than he earned. His Instagram? A gallery of fake luxury, all carefully curated to hide the fact that he was neck-deep in overdue bills. In 2019, a local bank even took him to court over his unpaid loans. Oh, and let's not forget their dear mother. She wasn't exactly living the high life either, struggling with her own financial troubles. The Wongs? A masterclass in how not to manage family fortunes. 3 years earlier, the court declared her bankrupt. The contrast between Abby and her former in-laws was nothing short of striking. While Abby gained international fame and built a fortune exceeding 100 million Hong Kong dollars, Her ex-husband and his entire family were stuck in place, practically leeching off her success. Now, as humans, we're prone to envy and anger, and those feelings can manifest in all sorts of ugly ways. Although Abby wasn't responsible for their financial mess, they were, of course, fuming at her success. Abby felt this growing resentment and, at some point, decided it was time to cut off the freeloading. She wanted her apartment back, the one worth $8 million, and that conversation, it didn't go well, so badly, in fact, that someone in the family actually threatened to kill her if she tried to take it back. To say Abby was upset would be an understatement. She immediately sought legal advice, but what stands out here is the size of this girl's heart. Despite the threats, she looked beyond the craziness and started searching for a new home for them. I mean, she even had plans to buy them property, which is wild considering the situation. Sure, her new place wouldn't have compared to their previous $8 million home, but seriously, what more could they even expect at this point? Sadly, Abby's plans never got the chance to come to life. She disappeared suddenly on February 21st, 2023. That morning, she left early to pick up her daughter from school, but when the final bell rang, Abby was nowhere to be found. Despite countless calls and texts, no one got a response. For Abby, this behavior was way out of character, and it set off alarm bells among the school staff. Given her busy career and lifestyle, Abby was glued to her phone 24/7, so missing calls and notifications, unheard of. Her social media profiles also went silent, which only fueled the growing suspicion. Within 2 hours, a missing person report was filed, and, in typical rich people have their perks fashion, over 150 police officers were put on the case. It didn't take long for investigators to find their first clue. Surveillance footage from her apartment complex showed Abby in a white long-sleeved top, white pants, and white slippers, carrying a purple bag. Based on the timing, it looked like she was indeed heading to pick up her daughter. The car on the footage resembled the 7-seater she and Anthony usually drove. When they questioned Anthony and his family, though, it led nowhere. They all claimed they hadn't seen her since the day she vanished. Despite their efforts, the authorities hit a dead end in trying to locate Abby. At some point, investigators turned to the car's GPS records, and what they found was devastatingly heartbreaking. Turns out the car was moved about 30 kilometers away from Hong Kong to a village called Lung Mei Tsuen. Once this rather sketchy information came in, dozens of officers were immediately dispatched to comb the area. They went door to door questioning locals, meticulously reviewed surveillance footage from nearby homes, and gathered dashcam recordings from all vehicles near the local parks. By Friday noon, 72 hours after Abby went missing, just 24 hours after Lung Mei Tsuen became a point of interest, the detectives focused on one particular 3-story house. Unfortunately, nothing could have prepared them for the horror waiting inside. Except maybe the well-equipped kitchen, because aside from that, the whole house was empty. Windows, floors, and walls, all covered in tarp. I'll spare you the gory details, but let's just say they found 2 human legs in the fridge. The kitchen? Oh, it was decked out like something out of a butcher's fever dream. A meat grinder, an electric saw, cleavers, meat hammers, protective shields, raincoats, and, oh yeah, 2 giant pots boiling away on the stove. Inside those pots, a human skull and various rib bones. The authorities were shaken to their core by the grisly scene, and as news spread, shockwaves of speculation and outrage rippled across the country, and soon, the entire world. After analyzing all the surveillance footage from the area, the Kwong family members were spotted acting, well, suspiciously to say the least. This led to a full-scale search for Abby's remains in the surrounding area, involving over 100 Hong Kong police officers. I mean, it's one thing to get caught red-handed, but cooking it? Unbelievable. In the search efforts, they pulled out all the stops. Divers, dogs, trackers, data analysts, and even drones. But unfortunately, despite all the resources, they still didn't find Abby's remains. Investigators confirmed they had a particular interest in a large plot of land on a nearby hill, but even that search turned up nothing. In case you were still in doubt, yeah, it really looks like the Kwong family is behind her death, and, as shocking as it sounds, it seems the entire family was involved, except for Abby's own children. Now, the burning question remains. What exactly happened to Abby on the day she disappeared? Here's what we know so far. Anthony knew Abby's usual routine, and with that knowledge, he and the other Kwong family members schemed to abduct her. It gets worse. Turns out Kao, the guy who had been threatening her, started laying the groundwork for this twisted plan weeks before, all for $300. He even rented the house in Lung Mae Tsuen, with the explicit intent of destroying all evidence after the murder. Anthony reportedly drove her to the entrance of Lion Rock Tunnel, where Alex was already waiting. They continued their trip northeast toward Lung Mae Tsuen, where they met their father at the infamous house. Later that evening, Abby Choi was reported missing. When the police reached out to the Kwongs for information, the two brothers and their father allegedly gave misleading statements. The sheer planning, the family involvement, and that pitiful price tag? It's hard to wrap your head around it. What's even more unsettling is the precision and patience they had to pull this off. Pure madness. So, the whole thing started to fall apart when their stories didn't match up. 3 days later, the authorities searched the house, and what they found was nothing short of horrifying. Anthony and Kao were nabbed that same evening, on February 25th. But Alex, he was nowhere to be found. As soon as the news hit the streets, Alex became the most wanted man in town, with pretty much everyone trying to track him down. A full-on manhunt was launched, and the government slapped a bounty of 200 million Hong Kong dollars on his head for whoever could bring this psycho in. Things got so intense that even the city's elite special forces, the Flying Tigers, were thrown into the mix. Now, if they bring in the Tigers, you know it's game over. Fortunately for everyone involved, Alex was caught the next day by some quick-thinking officers down at the pier. Turns out, the genius was trying to sneak out of the country on a yacht. He had over $500,000 HK on him and a collection of luxury watches and jewelry worth around $4 million. His brilliant escape plan? Slip the yacht's crew a cool $13,000 to let him stow away like a runaway cat. But thank God, instead of sailing away to freedom, this idiot ended up behind bars where he belongs. After the arrest, police hit Alex, Kao, and Anthony with unofficial murder charges. Even Xiao's mistress wasn't safe. They suspected she helped Alex with his little escape scheme. A couple more people were dragged into the mess too, including the sailor who was supposed to smuggle him out in one of Alex's buddies. And then came the heartbreaking part. Tributes to Abby started pouring in from her family, colleagues, and her countless friends. Even her last husband, Chris Tam, spoke up, calling her a kind soul who always wanted to help others and who was always there for him. Her friends? They remembered her as loving, caring, and strong, someone who managed to be successful while also being an incredible human being. She left behind 4 children, and right now, as you're watching this video, her mother is fighting in court to gain custody of them and make sure they stay within the Choi family. If this story hit you, make sure to like the video and drop a comment about what you think of the case. Thanks for watching. The story you are about to hear tonight began after an act of revenge which, according to the man himself, ended with a passion for the taste of human flesh. that feeling of dominance and control one gets after taking another's life. This is what drove this man, Joseph Roy Metheny, a morbidly obese individual with a penetrating gaze and thick features, an intimidating smile, standing 6 feet 1 inch tall and weighing over 330 pounds. He mentioned in his statement, "The next time you drive down the road and come across a burger stand you've never seen before, think about this story carefully, because you never know who you might be eating." This criminal story features Joseph Roy Metheny, who was born on the 2nd of March, 1955, in Baltimore, United States, to a family of 6 children, where they were mostly neglected by their parents, as his father had a drinking problem and spent all their money on alcohol, forcing his mother to work hard to support them. At the age of 6, his father died in a car accident, and the children were left in their mother's care. She took on the family's responsibilities but neglected them even more because she had to work double shifts to make ends meet. As a waitress and a food truck driver, Metheny and his siblings were often sent to live with other families in the foster care system, which allows children in dangerous, abusive, or neglectful situations to live in a safe place temporarily until it's determined they can return to their biological parents, or, in some cases, the foster family wishes to adopt them. Joseph sought comfort in food, and he began overeating, which led to serious obesity problems that worsened as he grew older. At the age of 18, he claimed to have joined the U.S. Army in 1973 and served in Germany. During his service, Joseph became addicted to drugs, which dramatically changed his behavior. This was just the beginning of many problems that would follow. His mother started noticing the decline in her son, who was distancing himself from the family more and more. His friends called him teeny or little, because he was 6 feet 1 inch tall and of large build. His addiction gradually led him to follow his father's path, frequenting bars and taverns, living with homeless people who had no place to go and who set up improvised camps in southern Baltimore. It was there that he met a woman, whose name is unknown, with whom he had his first child. After learning he was going to be a father, he got a job at a company where things were going well since he was considered intelligent, well-spoken, and very polite. Few people knew he had an addiction problem. Everything began on a night in July 1994. Joseph was at work, driving a forklift at a company called Pallets, which specialized in selling and manufacturing wooden platforms. That night, he worked late, doing overtime. After finishing his shift, he headed home as usual. When he opened the door and turned on the light, he noticed the house was empty. Neither his 6-year-old son nor his wife were there. She had taken everything and left him. Seeing the silence in his home, he became furious. Not so much because of the loss of his wife, who was also addicted to drugs and with whom he frequently fought, but because he loved his son. In fact, he referred to his wife as trash, who consumed all kinds of substances. After a few days, he started looking for them everywhere, but had no success. It wasn't until 6 months later that some people told him they had seen her on the other side of the city with a man who forced her to offer intimate services in exchange for drugs, without caring that the child was present. A few days later, his ex-wife and her partner were arrested for using and carrying illegal substances, and the child was taken away for neglect and child abuse. Joseph couldn't do anything to get his son back, and this filled him with hatred toward his wife and her partner. He felt that they needed to pay for what they had done, taking his son from him. So he began searching for both of them after learning they had been released. The only punishment they received was losing custody of the child. He found out they were living under a bridge with other drug addicts and homeless people, so one day he decided to go after them. But unfortunately, he didn't find them. However, he did find 2 people lying on a filthy old mattress, and seeing them reminded him why his son had been taken away, so he exploded in anger and killed them with an axe. Afterward, he hid their bodies in some bushes and continued searching around the area. That same night, he kept looking under nearby bridges. It was then that he saw two women near the spot where he had committed the murders. He approached them and tried to get information about his wife's whereabouts. One of the women walked a few meters away, where he interrogated her, but due to drug influence, she wasn't thinking clearly and acted as if she knew nothing. Since he couldn't get what he wanted, he started beating her, then assaulted her and ultimately killed her. Once he was done with her, he dragged her to some bushes and left her there. Then he went after the other woman and did the same, but she claimed she didn't know who he was talking about, so he killed her too. Just as he was about to throw her into the bushes with the other woman, he noticed an old man fishing by the river, watching him. So, he grabbed a piece of steel lying among the trash and ran toward him. When the old man tried to react, he was met with a series of blows that ended his life. After realizing what he had done, he dragged the victims' bodies to the side of the Patapsco River in Baltimore, Maryland, and tried to cover them with stones. Then he washed himself in the river and tried to clean up the area as much as he could to avoid leaving any clues. That night, he claimed he had committed 5 murders in approximately 7 hours while searching for his wife. One night in 1994, he lured 39-year-old Kathy Ann Magaziner, who had a criminal record, to the factory. They used illicit substances together, and when she refused to be intimate with him, he strangled her to death. Afterward, he dug a shallow grave in a small forest behind the factory, where her body remained unnoticed for 6 months, until Joseph dug up her head and threw it in the trash. The body stayed there for years. On the 2nd of August, 1995, the bodies of the homeless men Randall Brewer and Randy Baker were discovered. Weeks later, Metheny was accused of both murders because some people had seen an overweight man wandering under the bridges that night, which led investigators to suspect Joseph Metheny. Bail was denied, and he had to remain in Baltimore City Jail for 18 months while awaiting trial. However, there was no evidence linking him to the crime. After a week-long trial, he was released due to a lack of evidence, as it was established that the actual perpetrator was another homeless man. Upon his release, Joseph returned to his former employer, asking to get his job back at the pallet company in Baltimore. His boss agreed because he considered Joseph a good worker. But that wasn't all. His boss also granted Joseph's request to stay in a small trailer on the property, with the promise that Joseph would watch over the place since he had nowhere to go after being in jail. So, he was given the keys to the entire facility, trusting in his good intentions. However, what the boss didn't know was that Joseph had other plans in mind because the company was located on a dead-end street, isolated from the highway, a perfect place for him to act out his fantasies. In November 1996, he lured Kimberly Line Spicer, whom he stabbed to death after she resisted his advances. He buried her body inside the factory. At that precise moment, he mentioned cutting off some of her flesh and storing it in containers, which he then placed in the fridge. During that week, he set up a small hamburger stand where he claimed to have mixed pork and beef with human flesh, and nobody noticed the difference in taste. In fact, he said many people told him those were the best burgers they had ever eaten. He added that everything was going well until he ran out of his special meat. On the 8th of December 1996, he brought his new victim, Rita Kemper, to the trailer. Joseph said they used drugs for a while inside the trailer until he tried to undress her. She refused his advances and began screaming in desperation. But there was no one around to help her, so in a moment of distraction, she ran out of the trailer. Joseph chased her down and dragged her back. He told her he was going to kill her, but she managed to escape again. She ran toward a barbed wire fence, but that didn't stop her from jumping over it. She made it to the road, where a truck driver stopped after seeing her. He took her to a nearby gas station, where they called the police. Meanwhile, Joseph gathered her clothes, knowing they would soon come for him. But as he stepped out of the trailer, an officer was already there. The officer told him to get on the ground, and he was arrested. As expected, Joseph denied all the charges against him. One of the accusations was that the woman had claimed he said she would end up like the other girls buried in the woods. Joseph immediately denied such words, adding that everything he did was consensual, so they let him go. Realizing that the police might come to check on the situation, Joseph asked a friend to help him dig up Kimberly's body, which was still inside the factory. Then, on the 15th of December 1996, his friend reported him to the authorities, stating that Joseph had asked for help moving a woman's body buried next to the trailer. When police arrived, they arrested him again, and even arrested the business owner for alleged complicity. Then they asked Joseph to show them where Kimberly was buried. He gave them the exact location, and when they dug, they found the body of a woman. That same day, during interrogation, he confessed to other crimes, including his previous victim, Kathy Ann Magaziner, and led police to where he had buried her. They found a shallow grave with her remains. Most of her skull was missing, but the victim was identified through her dental records. It was confirmed to be Kathy. However, days later, Joseph claimed to be a serial killer who had committed 13 murders. According to him, he had thrown bodies into the Patapsco River, and they had never been found. He even claimed to have cut up many of his victims and stored their meat for later consumption. Eventually, he came up with the idea of setting up a food stand to sell human flesh mixed with animal meat. At first, his statements were shocking, but as time passed, doubts began to arise about their truthfulness. Every day he was interrogated in a small room, as investigators were trying to solve many unsolved cases. Trying to uncover what he had done, they took him out of jail every day, moving him from place to place, hoping he would lead them to where he had disposed of the bodies. This went on for a month, and they were never able to find any of the victims Joseph claimed to have killed. At this point, the detectives weren't sure if Joseph was telling the truth or just rambling because his statements were incredibly inconsistent. His stories sounded too fantastical to be true. The main challenge in investigating Joseph Metheny was that he was also a liar, with the ability to make up stories while recounting events. In 1997, he was tried for the case of Rita Kemper, the last victim who managed to escape, and he was sentenced to 50 years in prison for attempting to kidnap and assault her. In 1998, he pled guilty to killing Kathy Magaziner, but on the 14th of July, 2000, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. No one could understand whether Joseph was lying for attention or if his mind was so unstable that he was confessing to crimes he hadn't committed. No evidence of the murders he allegedly committed was ever found. It was also never proven that he opened his food stand to sell human meat. The only murders he was definitively linked to were 2. His mental instability was evident, leading him to create false confessions. In his final words, he said, "The words, 'I'm sorry,' will never leave my mouth because it would be a lie. I am more than willing to give my life for what I've done so that God can judge me and send me to hell for eternity. I simply enjoyed it." On Saturday, the 5th of August, 2017, he was mysteriously found dead in his cell at approximately 3 p.m. in the Western Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland, from unknown causes at the age of 62. This case is a clear example that not everything killers confess is true, as many tend to claim crimes they didn't commit, seeking importance and recognition. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. I hope you had an excellent night and continue enjoying another day. This is Mr. Fear. Until the next episode. A young woman disappeared from her home under very strange circumstances. What followed resembled an incredibly twisted movie plot more than a real-life case. It was hard to believe what was happening, as such a combination of events was extremely rare. When the unexpected truth was finally revealed 15 years later, it only made things worse. Jessica Dishon was born on the 2nd of May, 1982, in the small American town of Shepherdsville, Kentucky. It was a quiet, peaceful place where most of the residents worked as farmers and knew each other well. Jessica had 2 younger brothers, and from an early age, she had to take care of them while her parents were at work. Thanks to this, Jessica became very independent, and her parents could always rely on her. At 15, she took a part-time job at a local restaurant to save up for her first car. Jessica dreamed of getting a red Pontiac, and after a few years she managed to save enough money to buy it. Despite her job, she kept excelling in school and planned to attend college to become an accountant after graduation. In the fall of 1999, when she was 17, Jessica started her senior year in high school. She also began dating a boy and was very happy about their relationship. The morning of Friday, September 10th, began like any other day. Jessica's parents left for work while she was still asleep. Her younger brothers left for the school bus stop and got on the bus. Jessica stayed home alone and was supposed to drive to school later in her car. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, her mother came home and immediately noticed something strange. Jessica's car was parked in front of the house, even though she should have been at school by that time. The mother went inside and headed to Jessica's room. Her first thought was that Jessica had overslept and missed school, but she wasn't in her bedroom. Then she thought Jessica might have asked her father to drop her off at school, but when she called him, he said he had gone to work alone that morning. The mother assumed Jessica might have had car trouble. She grabbed the spare key from the house to try starting the car, but when she approached it, a worrying sight opened before her. The driver's door was slightly ajar, and Jessica's cell phone lay on the seat with the numbers 9 and 1 already entered. Under the seat was one of Jessica's sneakers, along with the car keys. In the back seat were her textbooks, work uniform, and purse. Immediately, the mother feared the worst. It was almost clear that Jessica had tried to dial 911 but hadn't managed to finish the call. Jessica could not have left all her belongings in the car and simply walked away. She lived on the outskirts of town, so walking anywhere would have required traveling several miles along a busy road. Jessica's parents called her school, which confirmed that she hadn't attended any classes that day. By the school's policy, they should have notified her parents earlier, but for some reason, they hadn't. A few hours later, Jessica's best friend who worked with her at the restaurant called. She said Jessica hadn't shown up for her shift, adding to the family's growing worry. At that point, her parents decided to contact the police and went to the sheriff's office. They explained that their daughter had missed school and work, and that all her belongings, including her phone with 9 and 1 dialed, had been left in her car. However, the sheriff brushed off their concerns, suggesting that Jessica had likely just gone somewhere and would return eventually. He advised them to wait until the next day. He was also unconcerned about the fact that one of her sneakers had been left behind, which would make it difficult for her to walk anywhere. Jessica's parents were furious with this response and tried to convince the sheriff that their daughter could be in serious danger, but he refused to take further action. Frustrated, they went home and began calling relatives and friends to ask if anyone had seen Jessica. No one had. Along with friends and family, they began searching the town for her but found no sign of Jessica. The next morning, they returned to the sheriff's office and insisted that their daughter was still missing. This time, the sheriff sent 2 officers to their house to inspect Jessica's car. However, the officers handled the situation unprofessionally. They inspected the car without wearing gloves, touching everything inside. Then they left without collecting any evidence or even checking Jessica's room, which should have been done according to standard procedure. Once again, Jessica's parents were forced to act on their own. They reached out to local media, telling them about their daughter's disappearance and the police's lack of interest in the case. They printed and distributed flyers with information about Jessica's disappearance, and with the help of friends and relatives, they organized search parties. Jessica's father, along with his brother Stanley, led the search efforts. They knew the area well and tried to figure out where Jessica might have gone. At that point, they feared the worst, that Jessica might already be dead. Stanley suggested they search near a local river, an area with a bad reputation. It was overgrown and difficult to access, and had become a spot for criminal activities ranging from drug deals to murders. The family searched the area for hours, but found nothing. The next day, something strange happened. Jessica's parents were at home and their son was playing in the yard. Suddenly, he ran inside and said he had heard someone shout, "Help!" and it sounded like Jessica's voice. Jessica's father grabbed his shotgun and rushed outside, trying to figure out where the scream had come from. At that moment, Stanley arrived at the house and joined the search. Soon, they noticed smoke coming from the property of their neighbor, 40-year-old David Brooks. As they approached, they saw Brooks burning something that looked like clothing. It seemed very suspicious, and Jessica's father asked Brooks for permission to search his farm. Brooks refused and demanded they leave. At this point, Jessica's family noticed another odd detail. Before Jessica's disappearance, they had had a normal relationship with Brooks and his family. But shortly after she went missing, Brooks began acting strangely. He would often drive slowly past their house, watching them and smiling. Not long after, Jessica's parents began receiving strange phone calls in which the caller would remain silent, only breathing heavily. They suspected it was Brooks, but couldn't understand why. After seeing Brooks burning what looked like clothing, Jessica's parents contacted the police again, though the authorities had still taken no active part in the search. Officers arrived with search dogs. The dogs were given Jessica's belongings to sniff and led the officers to the remains of the fire on Brooks' property, but no useful evidence was found. The dogs also found a pair of black gloves in one of Brooks' barns that smelled of decomposition. Throughout the search, Brooks behaved suspiciously, and when officers approached the remains of the fire, his odd behavior intensified. However, the police did not see any direct connection between Brooks and Jessica's disappearance, so they left without taking any further action. Once again, Jessica's parents were left disappointed by the police's lack of involvement. They decided to take matters into their own hands once more and called the FBI. Unlike the local authorities, the FBI took the family's concerns seriously. Upon hearing the troubling details of the case, they agreed that something terrible might have happened to Jessica. From that point on, a proper investigation began, the kind the local police had failed to carry out. FBI agents collected fingerprints from Jessica's room and car, as well as any potential evidence they could find. They also organized a large-scale search operation using helicopters and volunteers. The agents thoroughly searched a pond near Jessica's house, suspecting her body could have been dumped there. They also examined Brooks's farm in detail, where they made a disturbing discovery. A printed photograph of Jessica was found in one of Brooks' barns. This significantly raised suspicions against him, but the FBI still lacked the direct evidence needed to arrest him. At this point, investigators began suspecting that Brooks's brother, Joseph, might have also been involved, as he too had been acting strangely. However, without clear evidence, there was little they could do. Despite growing certainty that Jessica was already dead, they couldn't make any arrests. Finally, on the 27th of September, 17 days after Jessica disappeared, the police received a call. A woman had been driving along a road near the river where Jessica's father and Stanley had searched earlier. She saw something strange near a tree and stopped to investigate. Approaching the spot, she realized it was a body and immediately called the police. FBI agents arrived at the scene and found a young woman's body. Several fingers and limbs were missing, and a rope, stained with red and silver paint, was tied around her legs. Some of her clothing was missing, leading detectives to believe she had been sexually assaulted. Due to the state of decomposition, the agents couldn't immediately identify the body as Jessica's. They contacted her family and asked them to help with the identification. Jessica's mother couldn't recognize her daughter by her face, but when she saw a small butterfly tattoo on the body, she knew it was Jessica. Medical examiners later confirmed the identity and determined that Jessica had died from strangulation. Her body was covered in bruises and cuts, and experts concluded that her limbs had been removed after death. There was another blow to the family. It turned out that Jessica had been alive for about 3 days after her abduction. This meant that the police had a real chance to save her, but they had done nothing. This realization devastated Jessica's parents. After the discovery of the body, the FBI returned to question David Brooks, and something interesting came to light. In his first statement, Brooks had said he had seen Jessica on the morning she disappeared, but now he changed his story. He claimed he had not seen her at all that day, and that he had been at home with his wife. However, when the agents asked his wife, she denied his alibi. When FBI agents asked Brooks what he would do if they found his fingerprints on Jessica's body, his response was highly suspicious. He said that in that case, he would have to confess. Although no fingerprints had been found, this statement made the agents more wary of him. Brooks also failed a polygraph test. Despite these red flags, there still wasn't enough solid evidence to arrest him, and the case stalled once again. However, investigators didn't lose hope and continued to pursue the case. They understood that chances of securing a conviction were slim without clear evidence directly linking Brooks to Jessica's death, and they kept searching for any possible leads while preparing for a potential trial. One piece of circumstantial evidence included a rope found in Brooks's car, which resembled the rope used to tie Jessica's legs. Still, no DNA samples were found, making this evidence weak. The trial against Brooks began in January 2003. Brooks's lawyer quickly took advantage of the complete absence of direct evidence. During the trial, another frustrating mistake by the investigators came to light. It was revealed that when Jessica's body was discovered, the detectives also found some of her missing limbs. These remains were supposed to be preserved for further investigation, but the local police failed to follow proper procedures. Instead of storing the remains in a refrigerated facility as required, they left the containers at room temperature, causing the evidence to decompose beyond recovery. As a result, any potential forensic evidence, including DNA that might have linked the killer to Jessica's remains, was lost. With no direct evidence or strong forensic data, the trial hinged on circumstantial details that weren't strong enough to convince the jury. Ultimately, the jurors could not reach a unanimous decision, and Brooks was acquitted. Under Kentucky law, he could only be retried for the crime if new evidence was found. Jessica's family was devastated by the outcome. They had been convinced that Brooks was responsible for their daughter's murder, and now they faced the grim reality that they might never see him held accountable. The years that followed saw little progress in the case. Jessica's family was left with unanswered questions and a profound sense of injustice. The case seemed to have reached a dead end until, in 2012, a new detective named Lynn Hunt joined the local police department. Hunt was assigned to work on old, unsolved cases, and Jessica's case was the first one she decided to tackle. As Hunt dug into the case, she was horrified by the unprofessional conduct of the original investigation. The case files were filled with mistakes, crucial interviews hadn't been properly documented, and key pieces of evidence were mishandled or never collected in the first place. Hunt realized that she would have to rebuild the investigation almost from scratch, even though 13 years had passed since Jessica's death. Her first step was to reach out to Jessica's family. One of Jessica's brothers, now an adult and living on his own, gave Hunt a box containing items from Jessica's car that the police had returned to the family after their initial investigation. Hunt was shocked to learn that these items had never been stored properly as evidence, which should have been done according to standard procedure. Though many years had passed and the chances of recovering useful evidence were slim, Hunt carefully examined everything she had. While reviewing the documents, Hunt found something curious: a psychological evaluation of David Brooks that revealed his IQ was just 61, an extremely low score. This new information cast doubt on many of Brooks' earlier statements. With such a low IQ, it was possible that he hadn't fully understood the police's questions during interrogations or had given confused answers. This revelation made Hunt reconsider whether Brooks was truly responsible for Jessica's murder, or if his odd behavior was simply a result of his intellectual limitations. With this in mind, Hunt began looking at other potential suspects, particularly people who lived nearby or were connected to the case. She pored over the details of Jessica's life and began to piece together a new theory. As she worked through the case, she became more and more convinced that the original investigation had overlooked a critical lead. In September 2014, almost exactly 15 years after Jessica's death, Hunt received a phone call from a colleague in a different jurisdiction. He told her that he had heard some new information. A prisoner in a Kentucky jail had been talking about knowing the true identity of Jessica's killer. Hunt approached the tip with caution. Often, prisoners would make such claims in an attempt to gain favor or negotiate for reduced sentences, and many times the information they provided turned out to be false. Nonetheless, Hunt knew she had to follow up. She went to the prison and interviewed the man who claimed to have the information. According to him, he had shared a cell with another inmate who had been convicted of sexual offenses against minors. The two men had bonded over their shared experiences and talked about the crimes they had committed. One day, this inmate confessed to killing Jessica Dishon. The name of this inmate stunned Hunt. It was Stanley Dishon, Jessica's own uncle and the brother of her father. According to the informant, Stanley Dishon had confided that he had been sexually abusing Jessica for years while living with the family. He had used threats to keep her silent, telling her he would kill her or harm her loved ones if she ever revealed what was happening. In the spring of 1999, when Jessica started dating a boy, Stanley became paranoid that she might confide in her boyfriend about the abuse. Fearing exposure, he decided to take drastic action. On the morning of September 10th, Stanley went to Jessica's house while she was home alone. Jessica had already packed her things into her car and was preparing to drive to school. Stanley confronted her, demanding that she break up with her boyfriend. Jessica refused and, in the heat of the moment, threatened to expose him for the years of abuse. Stanley lost control. As Jessica reached for her phone to call 911, Stanley attacked her. She managed to escape into the house, but he followed her into her bedroom, struck her, and wrapped her in her bedsheet. Stanley then took Jessica to an abandoned shed near where her body would later be discovered. He kept her alive for several days, continuing to abuse her until he ultimately killed her by strangulation. Afterward, he left her body in a visible spot to ensure it would be found and buried the bedsheet under the floor of the shed. To mislead investigators, Stanley mutilated Jessica's body, hoping that the brutal condition of the remains would suggest involvement from drug dealers or other criminals. The most chilling part of Stanley's confession, according to the informant, was a detail that had never been made public. Stanley claimed to have hidden one of Jessica's sneakers under a broken tree near the shed. This information immediately struck Detective Hunt as credible. No one outside of law enforcement or the family knew about the missing sneaker. Realizing that this tip could break open the case, Hunt organized a search for the buried evidence. Due to the small size of the local police force, she lacked enough officers to assist in the search, so she turned to Jessica's family for help. However, she didn't tell them that Stanley was now the prime suspect, not wanting to accuse a close family member before she had solid proof. On the first day of the search, heavy rain made it difficult to find anything, and the effort didn't yield any results. But the next day, Jessica's brother and Detective Hunt returned to the area. While driving, Jessica's brother pointed out an old, abandoned shed that they hadn't thoroughly searched before. They went inside and began digging near the floor. Almost immediately, they found what they had been looking for, a bedsheet buried in the ground. Hunt rushed back to Jessica's house, where the family had preserved her bedroom exactly as it had been on the day she disappeared. The missing bedsheet was part of a distinctive set, and when Hunt compared the pattern on the sheet they had found to the bedding in Jessica's room, it matched perfectly. The missing sheet had finally been located, linking Stanley to the crime. With this discovery, Stanley Dishon was arrested and brought in for questioning. Throughout the interrogation, Stanley appeared nervous and visibly shaken, but he refused to admit to the murder. Despite his denials, the physical evidence, combined with the informant's tip, was enough to charge Stanley with Jessica's murder. The case was finally moving forward after years of stagnation. For Jessica's father, the revelation that his own brother had been responsible for his daughter's death was a crushing blow. Initially, he refused to believe that Stanley could have done something so horrific. It took time for him to come to terms with the fact that his own brother, someone he had trusted, had not only killed Jessica but had also been abusing her for years. A painful memory resurfaced during this time. On the third day, after Jessica's disappearance, her younger brother had heard a cry for help outside their home, believing it was Jessica's voice. While the family had dismissed it as a hallucination caused by stress, they now realized that Stanley had been nearby at that moment. Stanley had even suggested that Jessica's father search near the river where her body was eventually found, steering them away from the shed where she had been kept. In hindsight, it became clear that Stanley had been trying to divert attention, knowing full well where Jessica was the whole time. As the case progressed toward trial, Detective Hunt continued to dig into Stanley's past. She uncovered a disturbing history of abuse that extended far beyond Jessica. Several women from the family came forward, revealing that Stanley had molested them when they were children, following a similar pattern of threats and intimidation. These victims had remained silent for years, but now they felt compelled to tell their stories. The pattern of abuse showed that Stanley had been preying on young family members for decades, leaving a trail of trauma in his wake. Despite this damning evidence, Hunt knew that convicting Stanley of Jessica's murder would be challenging. There was no DNA evidence directly linking him to the crime, and most of the evidence was circumstantial. The bedsheet provided a strong connection, but it was not definitive proof of guilt. Without a full confession or physical evidence like fingerprints or DNA, the prosecution faced an uphill battle. As Hunt prepared for the trial, she made another shocking discovery. While going through old files, she found a letter dated June 26, 2002. It was from another prison informant who had written to the police, claiming that Stanley had confessed to Jessica's murder while serving time for another offense. The letter described details that matched the information Hunt had recently received, but incredibly, the police had ignored it. At the time, they had been so focused on David Brooks as the main suspect that they never pursued this lead. Had they acted on the letter in 2002, the case could have been solved years earlier. Frustrated by the failures of the initial investigation, Hunt pressed forward, determined to see justice served. The trial against Stanley Dishon began in 2015, but Stanley continued to deny his involvement in Jessica's death. His family, sitting in the courtroom, found it difficult to even look at him, knowing the horrors he had inflicted on their daughter. They were also angry that he refused to confess and take responsibility for his actions. The prosecution understood that securing a conviction on the murder charge would be difficult. Without direct evidence, they couldn't be certain of a guilty verdict. Additionally, the victims of Stanley's sexual abuse faced their own difficult decisions. Each of them would have to testify in court, reliving their trauma in front of the jury and endure the defense's attempts to discredit their testimony. Given the challenges, the prosecution offered Stanley a plea deal. They would drop the murder charge if he pleaded guilty to multiple counts of sexual abuse and involuntary manslaughter. In exchange, the state agreed not to pursue the death penalty. Stanley accepted the deal, but even then, he refused to reveal the full details of what had happened to Jessica. This plea deal resulted in a 20-year prison sentence for Stanley, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. At the time of his sentencing, Stanley was 56 years old, meaning he could be eligible for release at 71. Jessica's parents were devastated by the plea deal. They had hoped that Stanley would confess and tell them the whole truth about what had happened to their daughter, but he remained silent. Her father, still consumed with grief and anger, declared that if Stanley ever left prison, he would be waiting for him, prepared to take justice into his own hands. In 2019, Stanley gave an interview from prison in which he once again claimed that he hadn't killed Jessica. He insisted that he had been at work on the day of her disappearance, though after so many years, there was no way to prove his alibi. He also couldn't explain how two different inmates, who didn't know each other, had come forward with identical stories, including details that only the killer would know. As for David Brooks, investigators still do not completely rule out the possibility that he had some minor involvement in the case. Stanley had known Brooks, and it's possible that he asked Brooks to help him dispose of some of Jessica's belongings or even her body. Given Brooks's low IQ, he may not have fully understood the seriousness of what he was involved in. It's also possible that the gloves with the scent of decomposition found on Brooks's property were given to him by Stanley. However, any further investigation into Brooks's role in the crime became impossible when he died in 2021 from heart complications. His death closed the door on another potential avenue of inquiry. One final mystery that continues to haunt Jessica's family is the memory of her younger brother, who heard a cry for help outside their home on the third day of her disappearance. At that time, Jessica was likely still alive, but Stanley had been keeping her in a shed several miles from the house. It's possible that the brother's mind was playing tricks on him due to the stress, or perhaps someone else was crying for help. There are even some, though unlikely, theories that suggest Stanley might have had Jessica in his car at the time. But these theories remain speculative, and we may never know for sure what really happened. This crime literally shocked two nations and brought them together in despair. The suspect in this case, who soared to the top of Japan's most wanted list, deformed his own face to hide his true identity from the world. Today, we will delve into the case of Tatsuya Ichihashi and his victim, Lindsay Hawker. This crime is filled with many strange and disturbing details, including plastic surgery and the use of a flower pot to evade detection. Japan's police hunted him for years before capturing him. While today's story takes place in Japan, we begin deep in the heart of England, in a small town called Coventry, known for its medieval cathedral and, unfortunately, the destruction it suffered during World War II. Coventry has rebuilt itself over the last few decades and has become an important location in the UK, with easy access to London, Birmingham, and most of the country within a 2-hour drive. This well-situated city had a lot to offer its residents, and one of those residents was Lindsay Hawker. Lindsay was born on the 30th of December, 1984, to parents Bill and Julia Hawker, and was a happy child growing up. She also had two sisters named Louise and Lisa. She attended King Henry VIII School, and after graduating from college, she decided to pursue university education. She excelled at university and graduated with top honors in 2006. She was highly focused on her future career and was also well liked by her friends. There was a lot of interest and excitement in Lindsay's life. She was talented, caring, and successful, but all of that wasn't enough for her. She decided to try something new before pursuing her master's degree. So, in mid-2006, she made a plan to take a gap year from her busy schedule. This plan involved traveling. She believed that taking a year off from her studies would give her a fresh perspective on life and help her see things from a different angle. Therefore, in October of 2006, she signed up for a language school called Nova and flew to the land of the rising sun. Nova was one of Japan's largest private language schools, recruiting adults from all over the world to teach English in both Osaka and Tokyo. Nova was considered a prestigious institution, and Lindsay was one of the few lucky individuals to secure a position as a teacher. In Tokyo, Lindsay was housed near Koeiwo, one of Tokyo's train stations, and she quickly settled into her new environment, which was just a half-hour walk from the city's main areas. Koeiwo was home to a variety of entertainment options, including food parks, shopping centers, temples, and just good bars. Tokyo truly had it all, and Lindsay was captivated by one of the most fascinating cities in the world. Later, Lindsay decided to move a bit further from the center of Tokyo to a place called Chiba. Rent was cheaper there, and it wasn't just her idea. She moved in with 2 other teachers who worked at different schools, and the 3 quickly became friends. After this, Lindsay's time in Tokyo seemed to fly by. Although she enjoyed her adventure, she often thought of home. Back in England, she had a loving family, many friends, and a boyfriend, so she kept in close contact with them via Facebook, Skype, and simple phone calls. 6 months passed after Lindsay's arrival in Tokyo, and it was March of 2007 when she had an unusual encounter. She finished her work for the day and returned to Chiba Station. While picking up her bike, a man approached her from behind. She turned around and the man greeted her, claiming she was his English teacher. Lindsay was confused by the situation. She was sure he wasn't one of her students. Without commenting, she walked away, but the man continued to follow her. Lindsay jumped on her bike and rode off, but the man chased after her, first quickening his pace and then breaking into a run. Given the many alleys and crosswalks in Chiba, it was simply impossible for Lindsay to lose him. He kept running and trying to start a conversation, asking where she was from and where she studied, but she still tried to shake him off. Finally, Lindsay reached her apartment, where she parked her bike. The man, known as Tatsuya Ichihashi, had been chasing her all the way home. When he caught up, he made a request that, despite his strange behavior, seemed simple and harmless enough. Tatsuya asked Lindsay if she could teach him English lessons. He felt he needed some help with the language and proposed meeting in a cafe, offering generous payment for her time. Lindsay politely declined, citing her busy schedule. Any spare time she had was for herself, to rest and enjoy. Tatsuya seemed disappointed by this response, but appeared to accept it. Then, unexpectedly, he asked another odd question. Out of breath from chasing Lindsay through the streets of Chiba, he politely asked if he could come in for just a minute to have a glass of water. Lindsay hesitated, but reluctantly let him into the apartment. Though she felt he was odd and made her uneasy, she figured it was a good opportunity to show him that she wasn't alone in the country and that she had some protection. This would also be a chance to show his face to her roommates in case he ever appeared again. They entered the apartment together, and while he was pouring himself a glass of water, he made his request again, but this time significantly raised the price. He now offered to pay Lindsay 3,500 yen, about $32 per hour, provided the lessons would remain strictly business. This was an offer Lindsay couldn't refuse. Though Nova helped her live in Tokyo, now she had the chance to earn a little extra money. Plus, it seemed like easy work. She agreed to his request, and they set a meeting at a cafe for a few days later. Tatsuya thanked Lindsay for agreeing, but before he left the apartment, he did something else. He pulled a pen from his back pocket, took out a piece of paper, and began drawing. A few seconds later, he handed her a sketch. It was a drawing of Lindsay. On the paper were also his name and phone number. Tatsuya Ichihashi was a 28-year-old man from the city of Ichikawa, also located in Chiba Prefecture. He was born in Gifu Prefecture on the 5th of January, 1979, and grew up there before moving to Chiba. He was raised in a wealthy family. His father was a doctor at a local hospital, and his mother was a certified dentist. As a young man, Tatsuya aspired to follow in his father's footsteps and become a doctor, but he failed his entrance exams and was denied further studies. However, he agreed to pursue a degree in horticulture. He graduated from Chiba University in 2005, and though his results were relatively good, Tatsuya didn't seek any employment. Instead, he lived off a monthly allowance from his parents, totaling 100,000 yen, or around $900 a month. And here we begin to learn a bit about Tatsuya Ichihashi's dark side. He had no prior convictions, but had been accused of theft and assault. Allegedly, he attacked a girl on the street and tried to rob her. The matter was settled out of court. His father is said to have paid the girl about 1 million yen, or $10,000. Tatsuya was also described as a loner, obsessed with physical fitness. He regularly went to a local gym and often cycled more than 25 kilometers each day. In addition to this, it was known that Tatsuya was a recluse and had no plans to seek employment. With $900 a month and $35 an hour for English lessons, he could easily afford his lifestyle. Now, back to Lindsay's apartment. After giving her the sketch with his name and number, Tatsuya thanked Lindsay for her time and the glass of water, wished her all the best, and left. Fast forward a few days. It was Saturday, the 24th of March, 2007. Lindsay contacted Tatsuya, and they arranged their first English lesson at a local cafe. Surveillance footage captured the two talking as they stood in line for drinks. Lindsay appeared relatively relaxed, but she subtly stepped back every time Tatsuya got too close. It is believed the pair sat and talked for just over an hour, and the lesson seemed to go according to plan. At the end of the lesson, Tatsuya claimed he had forgotten his money. "Don't worry," he said. "I live less than a kilometer from here. Why don't you come by, pick up your payment, and then you can go about your day," he suggested. Lindsay agreed, and they hailed a taxi. She hadn't brought her bike that day, and she had work scheduled for later that afternoon. So, when they reached Tatsuya's apartment, she asked the taxi driver to wait for her. The driver agreed, and Lindsay followed Tatsuya inside his apartment. Minutes passed, but Lindsay did not return. The taxi driver thought this was a little strange, but didn't give it much thought at the time. Perhaps her plans had changed. He eventually left, forgetting about the incident entirely. However, later that day, Lindsay didn't show up for work. Even worse, she never returned to her apartment. Her roommates, already noticing her absence and aware she had missed work, began to worry. Later that night, they called the police to report her missing. Saturday turned into Sunday, and Sunday into Monday. Lindsay's family and friends back home in the UK were also becoming anxious, as she hadn't been in touch for days. The real panic set in on Tuesday, when she missed her second day of work. The school contacted her parents to inform them that Lindsay had missed 2 days of work. After this, they immediately got in touch with the police. It was at this point that the Japanese authorities began to take Lindsay's disappearance more seriously. The first thing the police did was search Lindsay's apartment, and the first people they questioned were her roommates. Luckily, they remembered the suspect. They mentioned that Lindsay had gone to a cafe with a man shortly before she disappeared, and they still had the sketch he had left behind. This was the first clue. Around 6 in the evening, 2 officers arrived at Tatsuya's home, but after knocking on the door, no one answered. However, His neighbors were home and allowed the officers to take a look from their balcony into Tatsuya's living room. The lights were off, but it seemed that someone was hiding inside. Strangely, a bathtub had been moved out onto the balcony. The officers immediately suspected something was wrong and called for backup. They were concerned that Lindsay might be held inside as a hostage. Within an hour, 7 more officers arrived. 3 hours after the first officers had arrived and backup was called, 9 police officers were now ready to enter and search Tatsuya's home. And then, unexpectedly, Tatsuya flung open the front door. In the ensuing chaos, Tatsuya darted past them. They tried to grab his backpack, but the straps broke, allowing him to escape. They couldn't keep up with him, as the building's narrow and confusing corridors gave him the perfect opportunity to slip away. Additionally, the police officers had no radio communication with one another, making coordination impossible. Just like that, in the middle of the night, Tatsuya Ichihashi vanished into the streets of Tokyo. Later, police searched his apartment, uncovering a horrifying scene: the bathtub. Inside, they found Lindsay Hawker's naked body. She had been buried in that very bathtub, which Tatsuya had moved out onto the balcony. The tub was filled with a mixture of sand and soil, nearly covering Lindsay's entire body. Only her right arm was partially visible above the surface. She had been bound with plastic ties and a gag had been placed in her mouth. There were visible scars and bruises on her upper body, indicating that she had endured a prolonged attack. Her belongings were scattered around the room. In addition to the soil and sand, Tatsuya had added chemicals to the bathtub to speed up the decomposition process. He had also sprinkled flower seeds over the top to disguise the tub as a planter. The seeds would eventually feed off Lindsay's body. Adding to the horror, it was discovered that Tatsuya had shaved all of Lindsay's hair off her head. Police also found several wigs in Tatsuya's apartment, leading them to believe he might have been disguising himself as a woman. This case quickly drew public attention, and rumors spread that Tatsuya may have killed Lindsay to wear her hair as a wig. The following morning, Tatsuya Ichihashi was officially declared wanted throughout Japan. The police swiftly distributed wanted posters across the country, and his face was featured on several news websites. Anyone with potential information was encouraged to come forward for questioning. Police raids were also conducted in places where Tatsuya might have been hiding. Yet, despite their efforts, Tatsuya seemed to vanish like a ghost. In the following weeks, there were almost no reports of sightings, and the few that did come in led to dead ends. The police were so determined to catch him that they even released photoshopped images of Tatsuya wearing various wigs, just in case he was using disguises. But Tatsuya proved to be a master of evasion, and he remained undetected, his whereabouts unknown for weeks, then months, and eventually years. This deeply frustrated Lindsay's family. In addition to the unimaginable pain of losing their daughter, they felt as though the killer had gotten away with it. And there was more. Lindsay's family felt that the Japanese police were becoming lax and careless in their investigation over time. This frustration reached such a point that, several months after Lindsay's death, her parents flew to Japan to learn more about the man who had taken their daughter's life. At that point, her father, Bill, did something rather unusual. He went to a bar where he had arranged a meeting with members of the Japanese mafia, the Yakuza. Before asking for their help, he handed over 2 bottles of whiskey as a gift. Soon, the Japanese police found themselves in the spotlight. How had a group of 9 police officers let a single criminal escape? Why had it taken months to interview witnesses? And why was the image on Tatsuya's wanted poster 7 years outdated? A rift began to develop between the police and Lindsay's family, and soon the British and Japanese media became involved. Meanwhile, Tatsuya was still on the run. In fact, during this time he traveled across much of Japan. From Aomori, one of the northernmost cities in Japan, to the southern island of Okinawa, Tatsuya continued to hide and remained undetected. He even lived on a remote island in a concrete bunker to avoid capture. A year after Lindsay's death in 2008, and up until 2009, Tatsuya was living in Osaka. Located not far from Tokyo, Osaka is a large city and a commercial hub on Honshu, the biggest island in the Japanese archipelago. Osaka is known for its modern architecture, vibrant nightlife, and incredibly delicious street food. During this time, Tatsuya mostly lived in internet cafes and worked at construction sites to survive. With the money he saved, he underwent plastic surgery to alter his appearance and avoid detection. However, he had already been altering his looks by crude methods ever since he had been declared a fugitive. He had used scissors to cut off his moles and parts of his lower lip. Eventually, he even threaded a wire through his nose to change its shape. By the summer of 2009, the police were desperate to find Tatsuya. At that point, the National Police Agency decided to increase the reward for information about him from 1 million to 10 million yen. They also announced that Tatsuya might have undergone plastic surgery, which meant he could have a different appearance. Therefore, people were urged to pay closer attention and look for distinct features. And this strategy worked. In October of 2009, a plastic surgeon in Nagoya informed the police that he believed he had just worked on Tatsuya. Foolishly, Tatsuya had agreed to have his before and after surgery photos taken. These same photos were handed over to the police and eventually circulated worldwide. Tatsuya panicked. He realized the recently published images had completely blown his seemingly perfect cover. What he didn't know was just how effective this police move had been. One of his co-workers on the construction site in Osaka recognized him and reported it to the police. Tatsuya knew he needed to get out of Osaka as fast as possible. His plan was the same as before. He intended to flee to Okinawa and hide out in one of the abandoned concrete bunkers scattered across its many remote islands. On the 10th of November, 2009, Tatsuya discreetly made his way to Osaka's ferry port. It turned out that a ferry to Okinawa was leaving in 3 days, and all Tatsuya needed to do was lay low and avoid detection. It seemed like his plan would work. Soon, he would be far from justice once again. But before he could board the boat, Tatsuya's luck finally ran out. A worker at the port recognized his face and informed security that this man might very well be Ichihashi. He was right. Moments later, Tatsuya came face to face with a group of officers. They asked him for his name, and at that moment, Tatsuya realized the game was up. He was officially arrested by the police, initially charged only with failing to report Lindsay's death. He was later charged with rape and murder. It would be another 8 months before he finally stood trial. On the 4th of July, 2011, Tatsuya's trial began, and the outcome was clear from the start. The details of the case were discussed briefly, with much of the focus placed on what punishment the court would choose. Japan still practices the death penalty, though only in extreme cases. However, Tatsuya was a high-profile criminal in the media, and the majority of voices supported the death penalty. During the trial, Tatsuya confessed to luring Lindsay into his apartment, raping her, and then strangling her because he feared the neighbors might hear her screams and call the police. On the 21st of July, 2011, Tatsuya Ichihashi was officially sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of Lindsay Hawker. While Lindsay's family had hoped for the death penalty, the court deemed it inappropriate since Tatsuya had no prior convictions. At the age of 32, there was still a possibility for him to rehabilitate someday. The trial would not have been possible without Lindsay's parents. They had to relive and revisit those traumatic events and even see previously undisclosed images of Lindsay's body. It's something no parent should ever have to experience. After Tatsuya was sentenced, the Hawker family made a statement. "We have waited a long time for this day. We've waited for justice for 4.5 years, and Ichihashi you took a precious life, destroyed everything for us, and stole countless memories. The life sentence that put Tatsuya behind bars for life was welcomed by most people in the country, and Tatsuya himself acknowledged his fate. Just before his trial, Tatsuya wrote and published a book in which he confessed to killing Lindsay. The book was his autobiography, describing how he spent 2.5 years on the run and what he did to avoid capture. More than 100,000 copies were sold worldwide. All the proceeds and royalties from the book, titled Until My Arrest, were offered to Lindsay's family. But her relatives declined the offer, and despite Tatsuya's strange attempt to do a good deed, nothing could bring their daughter back. Lindsay was loved, successful, and irreplaceable. She had gained incredible life experiences abroad, doing good by teaching others a valuable new skill, and in the end, her kindness was exploited by a strange and heartless man. She is missed every day. Is his sentence enough? Let us know in the comments.